So in this chapter, we're going to focus on color and how Painter represents color for the artist. We've already looked at some of the brushes, and we've already looked at some of the different paper textures that you can work with in Painter. And of course, one of the strengths of Painter is that you can have a lot more variety in paper texture than you really could ever have in the real world. However, there are some advantages and disadvantages to the way that color works in Painter. And when I'm talking about how color works in Painter, I'm always going to be comparing Painter to traditional media in the real world because I can give you an accurate comparison of the two. And one of the biggest differences and one of the hardest leaps to make for somebody who's used to working with color in the real world is when they move from traditional media to the digital media, they find that colors don't work at all the same. And the main reason why that is because when we're working in digital media, and Painter is considered a digital media, we're working with what's known as additive color. And additive color basically works like shining different color flashlights at a wall. And as you get all these different color flashlights to converge on one point, the light gets brighter and brighter and whiter and whiter because they're all adding up to the brightest possible amount of light on that wall. And this is really the way that monitors work. It's the way that pretty much all computer equipment works except for printers. Now, when we are working in traditional media, when we're working in the real world, we're working with what's known as subtractive color. And the idea with subtractive color is that the white of the paper is the lightest element. And then everything that we do in terms of adding color is making the paper darker and darker and darker until we eventually get to black. Now, Painter tries to simulate some of that with some of its brushes and some of its merge modes. But the reality of it is that it's just a simulation because inherently at the core of how the computer works, we're dealing with additive color. And we'll see this when we're working with our color panel. Now, if you don't have your color panel open, make sure you go to Window and go to Color Panels and just choose Color so that we have this open right now. Now, I'm going to rip this off so that we can just focus on this one for right now. And I'll just go ahead and close the rest of this out so that we can really look at this guy for right now. The first thing that you want to notice about this is that we're set at HSV. And what that basically means is hue, saturation, and value. And each of these sliders can be dragged to create different colors, and we'll see the corresponding placement of the color within the color gamut. And that's a fancy word that basically just means how many colors can possibly be created in Painter. The hue goes from 0 to 255. And the saturation goes from 0 to 255. And the value goes from 0 to 255. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that there's 256 possible variations of each hue, saturation, and value. Now, what is a hue? Well, a hue is this outer ring that you see around our color picker here. What we're doing when we're rotating around this ring is we're picking a hue. And as I'm rotating around that ring, you see that center triangle is changing. So if I go ahead and click there to select that point over on the saturated side and I begin to rotate, you'll also see that this color chip right here is also changing as we're rotating around that hue. And the only slider that's changing, if you keep your eye down here on the sliders, the only slider that's changing is the hue slider. So that's what a hue is. What this ring is doing is it's rotating through all the possible hues of the rainbow. Now, saturation is how intense a color is. So a intensely saturated color would be at this end of the triangle, and a desaturated color would be over here on this side of the triangle. So basically, these colors on this side here have no saturation, whereas as we go to this peak of this triangle, we're getting more and more saturated. And as I go ahead and move this guy out, you'll see that that saturation slider is moving in order to compensate for the data that it's getting from this little picker that we have right here. And of course, you'll also see that this main color swatch is changing as well. So when we change our hue and we change our saturation, we're going to get a very different color. And of course, that's reflected in our color chip. The final slider here is value. And value basically is referring to, is it light or is it dark? Here in this situation, we maybe want something that's desaturated, but we want it to be a fairly dark value, and maybe we want it to be a green. So now we have, in this main color picker right here, we have a desaturated dark valued green. If let's say we want a lightly valued saturated yellow. So maybe we're going to go ahead and pick something like that. So that's lightly valued, it's saturated, and it's yellow. And of course, you can see these values reflected in our hue saturation value sliders. And we can begin to change these manually here numerically to pick a color. And this allows us a lot of precision when we get close to what we're looking for. But say we want that color, but we want it less saturated. We can just drop the saturation. It will automatically move it over for you to the appropriate slot to give you these numerical values. Now, there's another way that we can view this color picker. And the way that we do that is we come up here to this little flyout menu, and you can see that we can display as RGB. RGB colors also work on a 0 to 255 scale, which means 256 possible shades of red, green, and blue. The problem with RGB is it's not very artistically friendly, and it's not really represented very well by this color picker. So the only reason why I would recommend ever using RGB is if you have very specific colors that you're trying to match from another source. But 9 times out of 10, I would recommend that you stay with display as HSV as your option here, because hue saturation value is going to make a lot more sense artistically than RGB. Now, in addition to that, you see this little icon right here, which is going to allow us to clone color. We're not going to cover this right now, but this is where we would access clone color. And if we click on this, you'll see that our color picker goes gray. And what this is basically saying is we're no longer going to take the data from this color picker. We're going to get it from another document. But for right now, we're not going to worry about that. The other thing we want to be aware of here is that we have these two colors. We have the main color, and then we have the additional color. Now, if you're used to working in a program like Photoshop, you may be used to thinking of that back color as the background color or the canvas color. That is not the way that Painter works. Painter picks its canvas color by choosing an actual canvas color. The additional color is simply there to allow us to do things like gradients. And we can change this additional color to whatever we want it to be, and then switch back to our main color. And the nice thing about this is that let's say that I'm working and I want to just quickly switch between the two. So here I'll go ahead and I'll paint with my Conti. So I'm painting yellow, I can switch, and now I'm painting red. And then I can switch back to yellow, and in this way I can build up interesting color variation without having to constantly go and find just these two colors. So this is a quick and easy way of working. But in addition to this, this allows us to have two color gradients. So let me go ahead and show you what I'm talking about. If we go to Window, we go down to Media Control Panels, and we choose Gradients. You'll see here that we have a Gradients panel. And this Gradients panel right now is allowing us to see a gradient between these two colors. If I choose, say, our additional color, and I change it to a different color like so, you can see the gradient changes. If I choose our main color, and I choose a different color like so, you can see our gradient changes. So the bottom line here is that the purpose of the main and additional color is really for ease of switching back and forth between two colors, and also for setting up things like gradients.